You've seen CSDM version 4 by now, right? I mean,
I have, and I actually looked through the what's new in 4, and it was quite a list. And I went through it briefly, and I haven't been able to circle back to give it a real good, thoughtful review.
Yeah. There's a number of things, but I mean, this is basically the build domain, and it's optional, right? That's the big deal. Technical service being part of the service portfolio, obviously, that's a big deal too. SPM supports it, right, out of the box, from what I understand.
You mean technical services and offerings?
Yeah,
they do, but it's a late edition because it's a different set of tables.
You're right.
And SPM was always the base service table, but then they promoted that one and created a new business service table as a child.
Yeah.
Makes sense to me, frankly.
It does. I mean, because we have two ways of classifying a service type, right? There's the classification, and then we have the actual CI class itself. Like, you can have a business service classified as a technical service or even app service, right?
That caused us quite a bit of heartburn, the classification, but we considered that to be, I'll use the word legacy.
Yeah.
When technical services and application services started to come on board, the actual creation of service mapping as a product caused some of those discussions to happen.
Yeah.
But I saw something today in our conversation that I thought was interesting around part of what has been historically talked about with services and ITIL and ITSM are things like infrastructure services, technical services, underpinning services, and all that kind of thing that were not part of the consume phase. So that's been a nice to see that CSDM kind of has a place for services that are only there as building blocks for other services.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
That's exactly how I describe it. Building blocks, right?
Yeah. And you've talked about microservices and so forth, which I wasn't super aligned with originally, but we did have some good experience and discussion with a customer one time, but they had like service parents. They had a hierarchy of services, and I believe it was 5 or 6 levels deep. And at the very bottom were services that were essentially APIs.
Okay.
And they managed an API like a service. Somebody owned it. They tracked who was using it. They tracked, all these things like SLAs. And so it was very much in alignment with a lot of things that we call services, but there was just a more technical aspect to it. Technical service and offerings to me, and I think you've explained it this way, or the example I use anyway, is like the Windows support service, right? And then you can have variations on that with faster response times and so forth that are offerings, right? Different offerings that you pay more, you get better.
That's right.
And so that's the example I use for technical services and offerings, or at least the one I understand to differentiate from business.
Yeah, I think, characterizing those technical services as building blocks is the right thing. And it's really that technology consumer that sets it apart from the business consumer over here. And so there's a number of things that come along with that, right? And I usually hone in on the subscriber. I mean, over here, the technology consumer is using these things that we order to build something bigger, right? They're building blocks. I'm ordering network gear or a server, or putting a piece of code on a server to get up and running, which is part of a bigger thing up here, at the app service tier. And eventually that it provides a business consumer value. But yeah, at some point we do call these services, and we tier it out from the infrastructure point of view. And then there's applications and platforms. We kind of talk about that. Applications like LDAP or middleware or batch services, things like that are still important, but don't have a direct impact to business. They have an indirect impact if they go down. So we're able to accommodate the technical service definitions, and not confuse it with the business services where you have an actual subscriber that could be an individual user, a group of users, a whole location. So there's a business impact if that factory, goes down.
So a couple of questions. Is that alignment of application service owner being next to a technical service, and then beneath there, you've got technical service owner next to a technical service. Is that new for version 4? Splitting out app service owner and tech service owner like that?
Are you talking about up here, like from these 2 tiers?
Yeah. So both of those
Yeah.
are next to a little avatar person who's next to a technical service.
That's right. That's right.
So application services they're not represented in the technical services table.
Not directly. And what we define the technical service as it relates to the application service. And one of the things we've talked about is renaming the app service to system, because it better represents the concept that it provides. The services hang off of that, right? Whether it's a business service and or a technical service or a group of them,
Yeah, I like that, because that it's better able to be a container of multiple things.
Yes.
When it's a system as opposed to an application service, it's kind of more monolithic in the latter.
Yeah.
And, it's interesting that, we're talking about products eventually.
Yes.
And what proposes a product is services and other things that come together. You've got a product there with the application service owner, almost with the technical service and the system together kind of are a product, right?
That's right. And the ownership, you have to kind of follow the consumer to owner perspective. So if I own, let's say, the ServiceNow platform, I've got a number of application services, let's call them systems for now. I've got the dev, maybe a production instance or 2. Those are represented here. And you got to worry about the consumer of ServiceNow, because ServiceNow as a platform doesn't do much. You have to establish and run products on it. So that's where we come up with, an app service representing the products that rely on the underlying platform instance, right? Which is the system or app service.
Another thing I think system will solve is the still continued, I don't want to use the word confusion, but lack of clarity around the word service with respect to that application. I think the word system will allow for the technical services and the business services to be seen more clearly without having to bring and explain an application service as part of that structure. So I'm completely on board with that. I'm excited to see that when it happens. A question.
Yeah.
The technology consumer, if we look at all those things on the left sort of as the building blocks, the service owner is the consumer of those building blocks. Who might be a different consumer of technology, the technology consumer, other than a service owner?
So yeah, what you're dealing with is a technology consumer's ordering, let's say the lowest level here, just infrastructure to build out an application. And the use of that technology is context is in the application service or system as we go forward, right? And once that's established, that's kind of where, that's why we introduced this build teams, because these are the teams that are actually ordering stuff to build the next application that goes out and solves world hunger, whatever, for the business. So it's those build teams, the developers, that are typically the ones that are the main consumers of technology. Otherwise, they don't need it, right? They would just go on the cloud or bypass IT altogether. But the reason we're here is because folks are building something, and that's really their main customer.
So the build team really is assembling a solution on behalf of the requirements of the service owner.
Yes, and think about on behalf of the service owner. Think about the service owner over here, right? They're the ones that are trying to provide something to accomplish work, that the business is trying to do, right? That's a business capability. And the underlying system and all the technologies are there. That's the main consumer. This is what matters most, right? If you don't have a business consumer, you're not in business. Really, you don't need it. Yep. So everything else is sort of contextual, and we built out this technology layer, right, to be able to monitor and manage these things, and eventually build out a business service, which then the business consumer can be managed.
Is technology consumer new for version 4?
No, it was in there in version 3. We had all this stuff in there for version 3. The only difference is we moved technical service into its own table.
Yeah.
Okay. And so now it's distinct. We don't really get confused with that whole service classification, dual way of classifying things. And it's part of the portfolio now. So it can be managed side by side with business services. So these owners now have a home. You know what I mean? They didn't have a home before. A lot of these technical services were there purely for event management. And there was no way to really manage the portfolio of them. Now they are managed as part of the portfolio.
It's important to get technical services into the portfolio because they consume spend. And in my opinion, the portfolio is a representation basically of a budget.
That's right. And so somebody has to spend money on upgrading these underlying technologies. If you don't upgrade the server, right, and it falls down, obviously whatever system it's part of and whatever business relies on it will fall down.
Yep.
And so these guys, it's funny because when I was at my former employer, it's over 10 years ago now, the database team or the infrastructure team would say, hey, Mark, we need to upgrade these databases or servers. And I would say, there's no budget for that. I would kind of, hide the fact that we needed to upgrade it and just take on the risk. And it should have been really bubbled up so that we had a business conversation to say, what, can we live with the risk or do we invest and get the money? Because that's where it comes down to is somebody needed to invest the money down here at those lower levels to keep the business running optimally, To
get a reflection of architectural risk, among others, from a technical perspective, visible at a service level.
That's right. And the cool thing is we can now, because we understand the technology is being used at a product level, right? If this version of model of server, this code from a vendor or whatnot, or even if you developed your own code and instantiated it down here, we now have traceability to the business service. And if you're doing subscription management, right, individual users or business units that might be impacted.
Perfect.
It's that traceability that's critical, right? I think that's the thing. And really the difference between them is the fact that these are people that build things versus people that are consuming things, when they're built. So.
Well, you're close to getting the Holy Grail here.
I know. And it's a bit recursive too, because that's kind of what these two layers, think about these two layers, right? These guys implement the low levels, the network gear and the cabling in the data center. Then somebody has to install servers on top of that. Then there's the, code running on those servers. So up until now, there's, you don't know who the end customer is. It's really this last tier that gets you there. And so there's a bit of a recursion of service use that happens between here and here. And then eventually it reaches a business consumer.
So the cabling and the other things you mentioned, those are additional examples of technical services.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's really important because when you're defining these technical services, ideally, this is really critical, is that the CIs that represent that hardware and software that's deployed in the data center would only trace to one offering and technical service. I find a lot of folks that try to trace multiple things to multiple offerings, and that's problematic. They're trying to put IoT or network gear into multiple technical service offerings. But if you do that and an incident comes in against that network gear, who do you assign it to? If there's 3 different offerings over here, who gets it? With three different groups, you don't know.
Well, I mean, and what you've also solved is not trying to use the business service offering as the place to hold the operational support information.
Correct.
Right. By having technical service, you're able to go one-on-one, whereas there may be multiple business service offerings that do depend on the application service being supported or the network gear being used or whatever. And that one-to-many or even many-to-many is valid and useful. But from the operational aspects that you described, especially assignment, that adds confusion. Is that the right word? Lack of clarity.
Well, it's lack of ownership or accountability. what I'm dealing with now is customers, when they set up their technical service offerings, they also define the query. And really we've honed in on, well, what's the CI class that they own, right? Or classes. And so we say, oh, they own IoT gear, network gear. And oh, by the way, they have multiple offerings because they're supporting development and production, right? There's two tiers of offerings because there's two different classes of service and two different costs.
So the dynamic CI group, not a new concept, but it's just been kind of ownership has kind of been assumed by CSDM, right? Because it's so useful for that scenario.
That's right. That's right. And we did it mostly because, historically, the query was embedded in the technical service definition when it was on its own for event management only. They basically, when they defined a technical service, they also defined a query in there, and that was it, right? They didn't separate out the offering, and the query just went directly against the infrastructure, and it was just monitoring. That's all it was really supporting.
Got it.
Yeah. So big changes there to support, I would say, this use case. The definition of an offering, with commitments and everything else. The only thing you have here is a lack of subscriber. Because most of this stuff doesn't have an individual or a location or user subscriber. The user was a technology consumer and they built something and then they walked away and they're doing something else, but it's still being consumed by business people over here.
I hadn't thought of that, but yeah.
Yeah, think about the car, right? You buy the car, you don't buy the individual pieces of the car, you buy the whole damn thing. And it's all supported. Now, parts of it are warranted differently based on their end of, their usefulness, right? But you buy the whole car.
Good stuff.
But yeah. So that's it. That's the big difference between technology consumer and business consumer, is that whole subscription aspect. The fact that these are the building blocks over here, and the layers, right? Infrastructure up to the apps and platforms used by technology people. And then eventually providing, a real business service out of that.
So another way to kind of hammer home the difference between the tech offering and business service offering is maybe in the diagram here, you display business service offerings similar to what you've got SDLC component and application service to insinuate that there are multiple versions. On technical service offering, you leave it as a single block without the ones behind it.
Right. Well, I mean, and the reason we did it here is because there are multiple environments, and also the application services are usually decomposed, like with microservices or platform versus app. So you typically have multiple of these. You may have multiple offerings, but not always, right? But it's very, very typical. You'll have multiple app services. Now it comes down to your rigor of managing them. I find a lot of customers saying, "Hey, we shouldn't capture app services for development, sub prod." But what happens if you get rid of the service or the application, right? From this point of view, did you get rid of all your environments, and do you have infrastructure hanging out there with nothing on it? Or no use of it. Yeah. So some edge cases that come into mind, though. So technology consumer, laptops. Would you consider that a technology consumer or a business consumer? Client compute. Yeah, exactly. Because you do have a subscriber, you do have a individual asset owner, thinking about asset management. But the technology consumer is coming down here. They're consuming an individual, not a server, but a laptop, right? A PC. And it's in the data center. Well, not in the data center, but it is a configuration item. It's something that is managed when a ticket comes in and whatnot. But you do have a subscriber. And so in that sense, right, the laptop could be a business service, but we don't have that dynamic CI group in play in order to associate all the PC class of machines. You know what I mean?
Some kind of hybrid, because you've got the scenario you just described, which is the actual laptop itself, but then you've got the desktop support service, which fits into the business service offering side, because there's no, well, that I may be talking myself out of this, because you could still have desktop support almost as a technical service.
You can. The difference is, though, you can't say that these don't have subscribers either, right? So now you have a subscriber.
Yeah.
You know who the business person is, and that means that kind of service is tied to the particular user, the person that owns that laptop. So there is some gray area, right, where we want to manage those PCs and provide business services for them. We do have the subscriber context, right? But it's more at an asset level, which is another conflict that we have to sort out, Dave, is that we got this notion of a subscriber in that case. If I subscribe to laptop support and now I want to look at asset management, I have an asset assignment, right? So the subscriber and the asset person are the same people.
Yeah, assets flashed through my mind earlier, and I just kind of tried to push it back, push it away.
Yeah. Well, and that's kind of, when there's an individual asset owner like that, right? I think that's where we have to collapse subscriber concept and management with the owner if they own that asset. Interesting times we got to sort out still going forward, right? But yeah, asset is going to be more prevalent as we roll product models into the mix, because for the PC that's on client desktop, it's not going to be connected to an app service that doesn't exist. But you do have subscribers, and I would even fare that this dynamic CI group could exist over here as well.
You see that maybe? Yeah. Well,
but you wouldn't have this. Yeah.
The scenario I was talking about earlier with the desktop support, you would use a dynamic CI group could enable the business service offering to be supportive of a specific subset of laptops.
That's right. And one of the examples I use is like in our own business model, right? We have different locations we do business in, and we have different desktop support groups that are in that location.
Yep.
So if I travel from San Diego over to the Netherlands and Amsterdam, go to that office, their support it's follow me. It's follow where I am is what support I get.
Well, those days are gone. You don't have to worry about that anymore.
No more traveling, right? But the point is, it is follow you, the consumer, and it is dynamic, and we don't really represent this scenario very well within the current model. Kind of interesting times as we get into that side, right?
Well, a lot of long-standing issues being addressed. It's good to see.
Yeah. I think we've got it, at least these two sides nailed down pretty much, and we're closing the loop, right? It's you may invest in this. The service owner needs to invest in building a new service, but they're buying an application, building it, deploying it, and then eventually business consumes it. Well, thanks, David. I think this is a topic a lot of folks really don't understand well. Technology versus business services. But if you think about the consumer and who they are, I like the building block aspect here. Versus over here, you have an actual consumer, users, groups of users, locations. It's no longer just a building block.
And like I said, I think that changing application service to system will give even more clarity between the different sides of a service.
Yeah, I'm glad we brought that up too, because this does confuse folks when they see service 3 times here. And the nature of this application service is very different than the nature of the apps, the technical and the business service.
Yep.
Yeah. Cool. All right. Well, thanks for spending a few minutes on this.
Good. Awesome stuff.
Well, appreciate it, David. And have a good evening.
Thanks. I'm sure we'll talk again this week.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.